Oh, why'd I do this to myself? Okay, so after the events of Drakengard 1's ending E, the world had become infected with something dubbed White Chlorination Syndrome, which caused any humans infected with it to either form a pact with an unforeseen god, becoming monsters known as legions, or be turned into a pillar of salt. This led to the creation of the Gestalt project, so that humans could separate their souls from their bodies in order to avoid such a fate, only reuniting the two after the syndrome was eradicated from the world. The process resulted in the manifest souls, otherwise known as Gestalts, and the soulless artificial bodies that went with them, called replicants. Geez, this really is like Kingdom Hearts. However, after initiated, an unforeseen problem occurred during the project, resulting in the Gestalts and replicants each developing their own sentience, their own identities, which would then form the foundation for everything that happens throughout Nier, for better or worse. Over the centuries since the Gestalt project initiated, the replicants have formed their own cities and cultures, being largely overseen by Devila and Popola, who have been tasked with keeping an eye on the project. Everyone has developed their own day-to-day routines, either running shops, operating taverns, or looking for treasure maps. But in developing their own identities, entirely forgetting their original purpose, the replicants have also developed a distrust and hatred for what they call shades, which are just Gestalts, some of whom have relapsed because of a flaw in the project, causing them to lose their humanity and go berserk, creating a rift between the two halves and resulting in the world slowly stalling out as there was no more complete humans left. The only Gestalt and replicant pair that we ever see merge is with Yona, which itself highlights the problem, because after merging with her replicant, Gestalt Yona has a crisis about the process because she recognizes that her shell has developed their own feelings and connections, and it wouldn't be right to take that away so that she could live on. So the Gestalt forgoes the merging by vacating the body, and allowing her replicant to live her own life, thus bringing into question if the process has gone too far at this point, considering how far removed the Gestalts and replicants have become from one another. But while I could dive into each character and their own little existential journey throughout the game to look at what they say about personal identity, the clearest examples really are with the two best characters of Nier's story, Kaine and Emil, who develop a strong bond over their shared pain coming to terms with their existence in the world.
No more crying, okay? Okay.
Now, while the Kaine we meet at first is loud, irritable, and blunt, when she was younger, she was much more submissive and withdrawn, due to being bullied and harassed by the kids of the area for most of her early life, something the adults either actively encouraged or outright ignored. It's subtextual and never outright stated in the story, but this is because she was born as a hermaphrodite, which is why she chooses to wear clothing that highlights her femininity. This isn't some Kojima, she needs to absorb sunlight type of explanation for a character wearing revealing clothing either. All the main cast respond to the way Kaine dresses, with Vice even repeatedly calling her a hussy or tramp due to how she looks. But she accepts it completely because at least she's seen as a woman over the years of being seen as a freak, which also caused her to distance herself from others. Even in a city like Facade, where they're more than welcoming to her after she saved two of the city's kids from a pack of wolves, Kaine chooses to remain outside. Before meeting Nier and the others, the only person she ever grew remotely close to over the years was her tough-as-nails, throwing rocks at shitty kids, grandmother Kali, being the only person to accept Kaine for who she was and raising her in spite of her own frailty, which would then inform Kaine's surly personality and penchant for swearing. For a few years, Kaine was happy, which just made it all the more tragic when the giant shade Hook attacked, tragically killing Kali and horrifically maiming Kaine. In her fleeting desperation to avenge her grandmother, Kaine then makes a deal with the devil in the form of a lonesome, spiteful shade named Tyron, offering to restore her body parts in exchange for possessing her and continuing to kill, thus turning her part shade herself. With this new strength, she would no longer have to deal with the abuse from others, but this simply gave others even more pause to accept her, as she was now seen as a possible threat by the townspeople. Between being born as intersex and combining with a shade, Kaine spent her life loathing herself for who she was, with Tyron being a symbolic manifestation of her own negative emotions toward herself and the world.
Stop! Don't treat me this way! I hate it when people are nice to me!
Is this what people call a big mood? In all her pain though, Kaine refuses to give up on living, as that's not what her grandmother would have wanted. at first focusing on the goal of hunting down the shade that killed Kali, and then finding new purpose in joining Nier in their journey to stop the rest of the shades plaguing the world, eventually even sacrificing herself to save her new friends. For the longest time, her shade powers were a curse, something that made her feel like she had no place in the world. But she finally found some comfort and contentment in accepting that it's a part of who she was as a person, and nothing could ever change that, which is a lesson she then passes on to Emil, who himself has to go through that same journey of self-exploration.
He's right! It's suicide! You can't do it! I won't let you!
Powers exist to protect others, right? Come on. Let's do it.
Kaine!
Being part of the National Weapons Laboratory, where he and his sister were experimented on to become weapons to fight against the legions caused by the white chlorination syndrome, Emil spent a majority of his early life defined as nothing more than an experiment. Eventually, after multiple failed attempts, he was finally turned into a weapon himself, but he wasn't kept to fight the legions like originally planned, but his own sister Halua in order to stop her when she went berserk after becoming the ultimate weapon, a rampage that would cause the laboratory to be shut down and Emil and his sister being abandoned. After losing his memory of the experience in the weapons lab, Emil then chose to wear a blindfold and hide away in the manor built atop the closed laboratory in order to avoid harming others with his powers, ultimately forsaking any sort of life for the sake of others, spending years locked away by himself, until meeting Nier and Kaine, who affirm that his eyes aren't a sin, but simply a part of himself to accept. After this meeting, Emil begins to open up a bit more, even using his powers to come to Nier's aid when the Shades launch their attack on the village. Until, in order to stop the rampaging Shade in the library, he's forced to use his eyes on Kaine, the one person who helped him realize his eyes didn't have to be a burden. Twist that knife, Taro. Then, after being reminded of his past when looking for a cure to his eyes while investigating the laboratory, Emil risks losing himself completely when fusing with his sister as a way of developing the powers needed to free Kaine, getting one last goodbye from his sister in the process. But upon the fusion settling, Emil came out different. He had gained the powers he needed, but he now looked like an enemy skeleton mage you'd fight in any other game, with vacant eyes and a giant eerie smile, which only caused him to suffer further. In another cruel twist, Emil can now finally look people in the eye without turning them to stone, but he fears others don't want to look at him now due to his appearance, which is why it means so much when Nier and Kaine recognize him for who he is and look past his surface, even if others don't, which may be part of why Emil is implied to have developed romantic feelings for Nier. Similar to Kaine, Emil finds a purpose for himself and his powers in helping his new friends, though this too results in its own tragedies when he loses control of his powers and wipes out the entire area while fighting a giant collective of Shades. A grim reminder of what he can now do as the ultimate weapon.
What have I done? I killed innocent people. I killed them all.
In the end though, after assisting Nier through the Shadow Lord's castle, Emil does finally find some level of comfort in using his powers to sacrifice himself in order to protect his friends, even if it's ultimately temporary.
I mean, without all this, I couldn't have become your friend. Goodbye, my friends. Thank you for everything.
Whether Gestalt or Replicant, almost every central character in Nier is struggling with what they are and trying to find their place within a world that's slowly dying and refuses to listen, which is a forced, awkward segue into the next recurring theme. So, I might be one of those big nerds, actually I definitely am, but I find language and the way it shapes people fascinating. I'm not a linguist, but the fact everyone in the world has their own native language that frames the way they relate to and view the world can tell us a lot. As an example, languages that use grammatically gendered nouns often shapes the way the user perceives those objects based on the gender used for them, like bridge being a male noun in Spanish due to being seen as strong and sturdy, but a female noun in German, where bridges are considered beautiful and elegant. Depending on the language you speak, it can influence how you see the world, and how the world sees you, which works as a recurring motif in Nier. To start, one of my personal favorite locations that you visit in the game is the desert city Facade. From the first moment, Facade is recognizably different from the rest of the locations you go to. While the village, seaport, and the Eyrie each have their own distinct culture and look to them, having a European-esque aesthetic to them, Facade is unique in that it takes inspiration from ancient Egyptian architecture and culture. It's made up of countless staircases like it's an M.C. Escher painting, running alongside a river of constantly shifting sand that they navigate over. It's a culture full of inane-seeming rules that don't appear to make any sense, and it's the only location that still maintains a monarchy or class system. But the most bizarrely standout thing about it is where the rest of the world speaks English, the citizens of Facade speak this strange other language that no one outside of the city uses. Now, in real-world context, the language is simply constructed by taking various katakana figures in Japanese and jumbling them up. So all the syllables are there, but they've been shoved together in a completely nonsensical way. Meaning, even in the Japanese version of the game, the language is still distinctly different from the rest of Nier's world. The fact these villagers speak an unknown language to the cast and the rest of the world adds to the strangeness of them, making it that much harder to understand the people and their bizarre culture full of contradictory rules and unintuitive architecture. Which does say something. Before picking up on the language of the town after being guided around by Freya and becoming an on-the-fly translator, Weiss drops a line here that even if you understand a language, you'll ultimately fail if you lack the knowledge of its culture, which is fairly accurate. Language tends to be informed by culture, so you need to have a grasp of one if you want to truly understand the other, or else you might as well just be using a translation guide. Because of the difference of language, the people of Facade and their culture are made all that more alienating from the rest of the cast, which just makes it that much more surprising when they're the kindest of the NPCs you meet. Facade is the only town that accepts Kaine with open arms, treating her with more respect than any other location. The king goes out of his way to invite Nier and the gang to his wedding 5 years after they saved him, not even batting an eye when meeting Emil after his transformation, and the masked people are the only NPCs you meet to come to the party's aid in the final moments of the game. Beyond the language barrier, the king and the people of the city are simply the kindest characters you meet. Real salt of the earth. Ignore that. Outside of Facade, language is additionally worked into the combat of the game. Throughout Nier, minor shades you fight will occasionally drop metaphysical words, which can change the nature of your weapons and magic by adding effects to them. Basically equating to, instead of the pen being mightier than the sword, how about you just write words on the sword? Effectively, better understanding the world's language intrinsically makes the character stronger, which is an interesting way of interpreting how the magic of the world operates. By learning the magic language the shades seem to possess, Nier can actually fight them better and become stronger. Now, unfortunately, these words don't feel like they have much actual effect on the combat, since they mostly add a passive buff to your stats, which can be challenging to tell at a glance if they're making any sort of difference, especially when the easiest thing to do is let the game auto-set the best words for you and just forget about it. But the fact the idea that language influences the world and how we engage with it is integrated all the way into how the combat works shows how much thought went into it. So, points for effort, Taro. Gold star. Then there's how this language theming gets layered even into the music of the game. And this is where I have to go on a partial side tangent as well, because holy shit, Nier's music is amazing. Nier's music is so good that even those that panned the game at launch had to give credit to how well done the soundtrack was. And a lot of that music quality has to go to the main composer, Keiichi Akabe, and the rest of his music studio, Monica. Now, there are plenty of games that are improved by their music. It's an essential part of a game's design. But Nier's soundtrack effectively defines the game. Take the track Grandma as an example. A song that sounds as if it would accompany a highly somber, tragic scene, but was instead used for the finale of a massive boss fight where Nier double hammer fists them through a bridge, impaling them on a giant wooden spike. Though the full scope of this song and its name end up being recontextualized during the telling of Kaine's backstory, where we learn the story behind her relationship with Hook and her grandmother. In fact, Taro would often redesign moments in the game to better fit with the music. Listening to it, there's a sad beauty to the soundtrack, creating an empathetic feeling that resonates with the rest of the world and its characters, mixing together layers of string instruments, piano, drums, and vocals, both in lyrics and chanting, the last of which really made the music stand out. adding in vocals isn't something commonly done in games, especially anything focused on its narrative, as vocals can interfere with the dialogue and vice versa. So it's easier not to worry about mixing it or saving lyrics for specific scenes. But Taro insisted Okabe include vocals into the design of the music, though it wasn't just any type of language that he wanted included, as he required that the language must not be recognizable, fitting the ancient-looking dystopian setting of the world. Despite sounding like it was from a bygone era though, the music was created to have a futuristic sound in mind, with the setting being more than 1,000 years ahead, but less futuristic in a technological sense like Automata, and more in a linguistic sense. When developing the score for the game, Okabe reached out to singer Emiko Evans, who had almost worked with Okabe and Monica Studios on a Dance Dance Revolution album a year prior, in order for her to do the vocals on the soundtrack. Because Evans was experienced in singing multiple languages, and was fluent in a select few others, she was the one that ended up creating the lyrics for each song, which she did by listening to the rhythm and cadence of a wide variety of languages and blending them together, creating what she would define as chaos language. With each piece of music Studio Monica created, Evans was asked to sound like a certain modern language without actually speaking clear sentences, such as the track Grandma having a French sound to it, or writing Kaine's tracks to sound specifically Gaelic, which she did by replicating the linguistic nuances and inflections found in each of them. This was done largely to give the game an almost alien feeling, removed from any language the player would recognize, while still sounding strangely familiar, by creating a distillation of languages thousands of years into the future. Because there was no translatable lyrics though, all the emotions of the songs have to be conveyed purely through the sound of the music and tone of voice alone, rather than specific lyrics. Okabe's musical composing ended up taking on a similar principle too, as he took a lot of inspiration from Western music, yet still kept a Japanese influence to his work, which gave the OST this otherworldly sound devoid of a specific cultural identity to root it to. Though as much as I can wax poetically about the music and its use of language, the biggest place this theme crops up in Nier is how it separates the shades/gestalts and the replicants. While the replicants you encounter throughout the game outside of Facade speak whichever language you set it to, the shades make these guttural sounds that feed into the monster creature image they represent. But occasionally, after killing them, you also get this childlike whisper coming from them. It's then during the second playthrough that it's revealed that the shades are actually speaking their own unique language, and you're given a translation of it by Kaine's shade parasite Tyron, which becomes a defining aspect of the rest of the game. Upon revisiting each boss fight, there are now multiple new cutscenes added in that show more of the bosses you encounter, elaborating on their own side of the story now that you have the language of the shades translated. Gretel, after losing their sibling at the start of the game, simply wallows in their sadness, rejecting these smaller shades offering to comfort them, but after talking with them, begins to bond with the shades. So once the party revisits the Lost Shrine in order to find the Shadow Lord, Gretel now only fights to protect their new friends from Nier upon their second visit, which Nier reads as a hostile attack towards them. Rock, the leader of the wolf pack fighting against Facade, were actually defending themselves from attacks by the replicants, which created a constant, never-ending back and forth between the two groups. Khalil and their mother were hunted down into the junk heap, and knowing there was no way to communicate to them that they mean no harm, Khalil's mother sacrifices herself to save her child. Then later on, Khalil and their new robo-buddy, P-33, are minding their own business, being best friends, only to be blamed for Jacob's death after his brother caused a collapse, because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time and couldn't explain the situation. It's easy to play ignorant when you can't understand the enemy, but as soon as you can, it's a lot harder to feel like you're in the right. Sadly though, while it would be easy to toss it up as a case of misunderstandings between two groups, this isn't a complete separation by language, as the shades seem to understand what the replicants are saying going by certain lines of dialogue. So even if language wasn't a problem, there's still a good chance things might have unfolded in a similar fashion regardless, as sometimes it's more about putting a face to a problem, which brings us to Now, a well-known concept in both communication studies and philosophy is othering. You've likely heard of this term before, but this is a concept where an individual or group becomes mentally classified in someone's mind as not one of us, compartmentalizing them as being from the other group, a group that is strange or different from those that are seen as belonging, which again comes up a lot in Nier's story. Whether it's the war between the people of Facade and the wolves, Gideon and the robots, the airy xenophobic tendencies, there's a constantly occurring theme throughout the game of one group othering another due to perceived wrongdoings or fear of strangers, whether there's a valid reason or not. Kaine and Emil's whole story arcs are about coping with the fact that they are forever othered by those they are protecting from the Shades. For her entire life, Kaine was rejected by those of the Eyrie for being different, being regularly bullied and forced to live outside of the town, which she then chose to own after learning from her grandmother not to care what others think about you. After his transformation, Emil too is rejected by people outside of the party, having to sleep outside of the town like Kaine, as the townspeople were uncomfortable with someone that looks like him around. And while Emil takes this in stride, knowing that the people are just scared, this ends up feeding into his own insecurities too. But despite being regularly victimized themselves, the main cast engage in othering just as much. In his single-minded devotion to his daughter, Nier believes Shades are ultimately to blame for Yona's sickness, when in fact they are only tangentially related. But there's a problem occurring and Nier needs something to project the blame onto, repeatedly relishing in killing Shades that are shown to be completely harmless due to his idea of what's right, leading him to go so far as slaughtering a village full of peaceful Shades coexisting with the replicants.
Would you be able to simply slaughter the people you lived among for so many years? Would you truly murder friends if you suspected them of being Shades?
Yeah, I would. Yona's not coming back to a village full of those things.
When the time comes, I pray you can follow through.
Despite being able to hear the language of the Shades, Kaine also regards them as evil, partly because of what happened to her grandmother and her distrust of Tyrion, but largely because she was raised to think of them as such like the rest of the replicants. Of the party, Emil is the least hostile towards the Shades, even lamenting the damage they caused the Eyrie after the boss fight with Wendy. But they undeniably, willingly cause as much death as the others due to their desire to help their friends, making you wonder if good intentions are a valid excuse, and why Emil has to be self-destructed out of the story after the third act twist, because his innocence as a character would not be able to continue on with the bloodshed after learning the entire story from Devila and Popola. All the way down to the gameplay level, Nier is constantly pushing you to change your perspective to see other ways of looking at things. All these beings have their own stories, their own purpose for fighting, which naturally breeds conflict.
You have your own motives, your own desires. And we have ours. I fear it really is just that simple.
While it's originally framed that Rock and his pack of wolves attacked Facade just because they simply hated humans, leading to the eventual wolf hunt at the end of the storyline, the truth of the matter is that the people of Facade started the conflict by slaughtering the wolves' families so that they wouldn't disturb the royal wedding, causing Rock's pack to go on the offensive in order to avenge their lost clan. Then when going through the castle for the first time, the masked people of Facade are portrayed as being heroes, saving the day by selflessly sacrificing themselves in order to help their friends defeat Mother Goose. But upon a second playthrough, it's harder to reconcile that feeling once you can understand the other side, and the fact that the masked people have just as much blood on their hands as the Shades they're fighting. But where we see this conflict perspective motif most is with Nier's main antagonist, the Shadow Lord. When the Shadow Lord is introduced, the game portrays them as being the ultimate evil of the world, a dark reflection of the hero, with Shades bowing to them as their leader with an evil version of Grimoire Vice. Even the name Shadow Lord itself is so tropishly villainous that it's just shy of being evil McBad guy. Considering the theming of perspective and language being so prevalent in Nier though, I doubt the name Shadow Lord being this cliche wasn't intentional. And not just in an ironic sense either. In stories, both in fiction and in real life, it's easy to portray the other side as being purely evil. This is of course not saying there haven't been monsters acting as figureheads of war in history, but every side will always find a way to other the opposing side, as it makes it that much easier to justify acts of war, which is exactly what happens in Nier. From their introduction, Grimoire Noir and the Shadow Lord are put up as the villains of the story, but in the larger context, the Shadow Lord is acting for the exact same purpose as Nier. Both are fighting to save their daughter, ultimately at the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives. it's not as if knowing the truth would have stopped this either, because even after learning that the Shades are the real humans during the first playthrough by Devila and Popola, you're then put into a room full of Shades that you can't leave until you slaughter them all, painting the walls with their blood. Nier doesn't believe or care what the Shades are at this point, and they've already done all the damage they could, so why stop now? Throughout the game, this clash between Nier and the Shadow Lord, two halves of the same whole, continually escalates and escalates, as both sides deal greater and greater losses, eventually leading to mutual destruction. After Emil, Devila, Popola, and Vice have all sacrificed themselves for the cause, Nier has finally reached the culmination of his journey, leading to a fight to the death between the two main figures.
You want me to understand your sadness? You think I'm gonna sympathize with you? I swore to protect my daughter and my friends. If someone puts them in danger, they must stand aside or be cut down. Come on, let's go.
So after defeating the Shadow Lord, we reach one of 4 endings depending on which playthrough you're in. The first is an ambiguously happy ending where Nier and Yona go on to live a happy life, where the second, going with the major theme of that playthrough, shows the pain Gestalt Nier goes through in losing his daughter. Then there's the third and fourth routes, which are only shown after you collect all the weapons in the game. Still don't get what that's all about if I'm being entirely honest, since completing all the side quests would have been more thematically consistent, and defeat the Shadow Lord once again, where after Kaine walks away to leave Yona and Nier to their happy ending, she's then taken over by the black scroll she's built up while harboring Tyron, resulting in one final boss fight. After stopping Kaine, Tyron then presents Nier with 2 options. Either kill Kaine and free her of her burden from becoming a mindless shade with no identity, or sacrifice his own existence to make Kaine human again. Now, the first option simply has Nier stabbing Shade Kaine through the heart, allowing her to fade away freed from her torment. But in reality, it's only right to save Kaine after everything she's done for you, which is why the fourth ending, where Nier gives up his own existence for her, is the true ending to go with. But this isn't a cheap sacrifice that only affects the narrative. Everyone in the story has lost something, and now you, the player, have to as well. In order to get this ending, the player has to delete their entire save file and everything they've worked for. All the side questing done, all the work finding every weapon and word found, the hours worth of time completing the game, it would have been as if it never really happened outside of your memories of it. You can't cheat this one by storing a save onto a USB or something either, as it deletes the system files and prohibits saves that have the same name that originally was used. In every possible way, this version of Nier is wiped from existence, leaving Kaine and Yona to move on with their fractured memories. In the end, there's no winners to be found after it all. There's no victory celebration, no magic MacGuffin that will restore those lost, and no happily ever after as the two leads share a kiss. All this fighting was ultimately in vain. The conflict between the Gestalts and the replicants has led to any survivors simply waiting for the inevitable death of their world now that there's no way to join them together again, and the one who could have stopped it all being forever forgotten by the loved ones that he fought so hard for. Yay! And with that, we return to that pesky question from earlier. Is Nier a good game? Well, not to get all philosophical, though it might be a bit too late for that, but that all depends on the meaning you attach to it. I've spent the last hour explaining what I think makes Nier so special, but not everyone's going to feel that same way, and I wouldn't expect them to, because that's not what art is about. And I'm pretty sure Yoko Taro would agree. When reflecting on his experience developing Nier after announcing its sequel 5 years later, Taro said, "I thought with Nier, I'm gonna make a normal game. That's what I tried to make, a normal game. Though people think it's very dark and somber, but for me, that's normal." To Taro, Nier was him expressing his own personal feelings through a project in his own unique way now that he had the freedom to. Now, to me personally, I don't think Nier is as dark as some tend to say. It's indeed tragic, and the characters definitely go through some shit, but it's also got a beautifully poetic message about learning to understand ourselves and each other better. It's easy to become hostile when we feel our loved ones are threatened, But much of the tragedy seen throughout Nier's story is caused not by differing ideologies that can't coexist, but by not taking a minute to stop and consider the other side. Even if many might say that Nier isn't fun to play, there's no question that there's something strangely compelling about it, both in its design and what it's saying about the medium. At one point in time, a media outlet described Nier as an ugly puppy, because it's not good looking by traditional standards, but it's also hard to look away from, and I believe that's kind of why it resonated with some. Yes, it's got its flaws, and sometimes you can't bear to look at it, but there's a certain charm about it that you just can't let go of, which is why it's maintained a following for so long. Fun or not, there just aren't a lot of games out there like it. Unfortunately though, because Nier performed terribly in the West when it first released, despite selling relatively well in Japan, Cavia was financially crippled, and its development partnership with Square Enix was strained, eventually leading it to be absorbed into AQ Interactive a few months later, which then itself was merged into Marvelous Entertainment. Though by that time, a majority of the developers associated with Nier had already left, with Taro himself going into freelance work, doing script supervision for a web browser game that never released. And so, Nier turned out to be both Cavia's crowning achievement and its swan song. But that doesn't mean it would be the last we hear from the creators or Nier itself. But we'll save that for another time.